Good morning, everybody. My name is Carrie Ann Royer. I am the Senior Director of Training and Workforce Development at Families Together in New York State. Today's webinar is a training on invitation to change, which is hosted by Families Together in New York State and CTAC and presented by Ken Carpenter, the Director of Training for the CMC Foundation for Change. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please feel free to reach out to our host via the chat feature, and Vanessa will be able to assist you. If everybody could put themselves on mute when not speaking, just to avoid background noise, that would be appreciated. We will have a question and answer section at the end, and we encourage you all to chat in your questions throughout the training as they come up, and we will keep a running list of those and we will address them as time allows. We would also appreciate if you could take a few moments to fill out our brief survey that will be in the chat at the end of our training, and this will just let us know if you have suggestions, topics, and things you would like us to cover in the future. Today's recording and presentation slides will be posted on the CTAC website within the next 2 to 3 business days. We are very excited to have Ken Carpenter, the Director of Training for the CMC Foundation for Change, with us today to facilitate this amazing training on invitation to change. Thank you for joining us, and I'll pass it on to Ken to introduce himself and get us started.
Oh, thanks, Carrie Ann, and welcome everyone. Thank you for making some space into your day to join me in a discussion of the invitation to change approach, which just stems from work I and my colleagues have been developing over the years to offer kind of structure and compass for those in this community that step into that role of helping others. So the goal for today is to touch on these ideas, introduce them to you, get an idea or a way for you to think about how they can be useful into your work, and hopefully leave today with that idea in mind and thinking about how you can bring your own voice to these ideas and concepts. Some which may be new, some which may be already part of the scaffolding you provide others. So it's great to be among you and seeing everyone from all across New York State. I'm going to jump into slides for a moment just to do introduction, and then we're going to do a breakout, just a way to make the room a little bit smaller. We're all in this community together, and it can be really helpful just to be able to meet colleagues that are doing the same work and get an idea of what brings them into this work. So we'll jump into a breakout for that and then come back around. As I jump into the slides, which will be covering the material we'll be talking about as they load, we kind of just wanted to highlight it's this idea of science and kindness, and I'll be touching on that, but wanted to start off with the idea that as we step into the helping role and we're trying to help others directly or helping families help their loved ones, that the concepts and ideas that I'll be talking about really are backed by science, but importantly, it's in the context of a relationship, that we don't have to leave relationships at the door to be of help. And often, sometimes the narrative is, particularly in the space around substance use disorders and those struggles, that somehow kindness has been taken out or the relationship has been redefined. And we just want to highlight both of these can coexist and create a scaffolding to help those we're trying to help, which is just the mission of the work I and my colleagues at CMC, the foundation, we're a not-for-profit, and we're really just trying to help put out in the world ideas and strategies and supports for the helping community, to build a sense of community, create a space where shared wisdom can come into play, and change sometimes the often unhelpful conversations and narratives that individuals run into or families run into when they're trying to help their loved ones. As a roadmap of what we'll be talking about today, the invitation to change approach really is just houses a bunch of ideas, concepts, skills that I'll be introducing and walking through with you all. They really just kind of hang out in three different spaces. The idea of helping with understanding and bringing a set of lenses to understanding or helping families understand their loved ones, or for those that are working directly with individuals who are struggling, how we can give them a set of lenses to help them understand themselves in their journey of change. Always keeping the role of helper in the picture. And we'll talk about helping with awareness, which is when we step into helping roles or assisting families who are also stepping into a helping role, how they can take care of themselves, how bringing in awareness to what's important to them and their reactions and how they sit with themselves is critically important. And then we'll just touch on some of the ideas behind the communication skills and behavioral tools that can be of use. You'll hear me highlight throughout all of this the importance of practice. We're not stepping into this work experts. We do bring expertise in our own way, but certainly one of the spirit behind all of this, that the part of helping and stepping into a helping role is making space for learning and some of the imperfections that come with learning new things. So this is kind of going to be the different things we'll be touching on. I do want to say, I hope this gives an opportunity to become aware of this. We can play with some of these ideas as a group, practice. There are PDFs we'll send, so some of these worksheets might also be something you may think about using in your work. With an invitation that there's always more room to do a deeper dive, and that's always that invitation for you even after today, knowing we'll touch on a lot of topics, more to get a flavor and an introduction to them. But knowing we do this work as part of a community, looking in the chat, just the wide community that we all share a desire to be helpful in this space and bring ourselves into this work. So I wanted to provide an opportunity for us just to get to know each other. So we'll be breaking out into breakout groups. There'll be 4 of you in a breakout room. And I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself to your colleagues in the breakout room and just touch on these questions. You don't have to bare your soul. You don't have to do a huge deep dive. But perhaps just sharing with your colleagues the greatest sense of accomplishment or satisfaction you have in your work when supporting others. What's one of the biggest challenges you have in stepping into that role? And just as important, why was it important for you to cut some room into your day with all the hats you wear to be at this training with all of us? So just a way, and someone can start and just go around. We suggest, again, maybe 2 minutes so your colleagues get a sense of your perspective on these, and then we'll come back into the bigger training. If these are on your handout, if you've been able to access your PDF on page 2, for those that don't, you can either jot the question down, because I'll stop my share in a second, or for some people, they just take a picture on their phone so they can bring that into the breakout room as well. Whatever works for you, so that you just know kind of the guidelines for sharing with your colleagues. And we'll be in there for about 10 or 11 minutes or so. So I'm going to switch, and Vanessa's going to invite you all to jump into the breakout room so you can all just introduce yourselves. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. I know before we'll be stepping into other parts of training, but I want to give an opportunity. So I'm going to apologize up front. I wish we had tons of time to get space for everybody to be able to kind of build on that. And I know that's just our juggling act, but did want to open up the mic before we jump back into the slides. If there's anything that anybody wanted to share based on just those questions or meeting your colleagues, you can raise
I
your
would like
hand.
to share. My name is, yes. It was good to meet Benita, and I believe her name is Katen. It was great meeting her, and it seemed that we had the same thing. The common denominator was housing with us. We all agreed about the housing situation, and it seemed, I mean, it's sad that it affects everybody the same way, but that just goes to show that it's just not in New York City, that it's all over, and we had great ideas and great thoughts, and it was nice to hear, their feedback on these questions as well.
Great, thanks, Dale. And just pointing out that those common threads that can pull us together in the work. So thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else? You can also feel free to chat. I don't know. That was 315. Everyone can feel free to certainly chat their experiences in there. And, as Dale kind of highlighted, can be a common thread where we're in the shared community where we're stepping in, and what brings us into this community, so to speak, the importance of the work and values. And I know the questions we're all asking you to think about not only that important part of what draws us to step into this space, to be there for others, and be at this training. So we'll talk about this idea of values, but also there's other questions saying that while this work possibly can be rewarding in a lot of ways, it comes with challenges as well. And anytime we step into that helping space, there can be emotional challenges for us. There's weight we carry when we're trying to be there for others, and that's part of the journey. So how we think about how we relate to all that and how we help others relate to that is going to come back around in our talk with self-care and self-awareness. But to highlight, there's multiple ingredients in the work we do. What gets us there, what we care about, and the weights that we carry by being there for others who may be struggling, which often can be a shared, not specifically, but in general, there's a shared thread to what brings us together as a community. Kevin, I see your hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had to run out for a minute. I had a client, but I was going to say that one of the emotional things is in this location, which is low supportive housing. Sometimes people pass away as a result of their addiction. In this setting, and that could be very stressful at times.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, Kevin. Right, what's at stake often, and what so many of you, the space you're stepping into, like you said, is really are with individuals where the outcomes and the experiences they have are quite impactful. That does include, Kevin, as you highlighted, the loss of life and the impact that has on loved ones and us as helpers that step into that space. So not to lose sight of that, and want to making room for what this work entails. So thank you, Kevin. Okay. Couple things I'm just going to present as backdrop, and I don't think I'll be seeing anything that's necessarily not known by everybody in this community, but certainly when we think about the backdrop of the work that we're doing is just how many lives are touched by addiction, by substance use disorders. When we think just in terms of a handful of substances out there in 2021 national survey, we can just see the millions of people that are impacted by the severest forms of these issues, meeting criteria for substance use disorders. And while the headlines speak to many different substances, we can see just alcohol and nicotine alone account for impacting over 50 million people. And we add marijuana and opioid use to that, we're tacking on another 20, so we're well over 70 million people just on these 4 substances alone. And when we look at the age groups that are impacted by this, certainly it impacts ages from 12 upward, but we really notice a spike in where it really starts to show its head in those young adult ages between 18 and 25. And for me as a practitioner, for all of us, what always stands out to me is when we're sitting and helping clients, we can also think about how many of those clients that are actually struggling with this come to reach out for the help of treatment professionals. And this slide just highlights the fact that a majority, almost 90% and upwards of those individuals meeting criteria for a substance use disorder do not contact any kind of professional help. So when we think about that, who's on the front line? Who are the individuals that are sitting and walking this journey with those individuals? It's not necessarily the professional workforce, it's the families, it's the peers, it's the friends, it's the other individuals that are out there in the world on the front line trying to help individuals in their struggles. And often that just means there's a lot of competing narratives out there on what's offered to individuals and what's offered to families. For those that are concerned, they may receive the recommendations, go to Al-Anon and Ar-Non, and that's not knocking that, but often that's the only set of lenses families are given, and they feel that there's their only choice or their only option. Or in extreme versions, individuals are told or labeled as being codependent or enablers and are given a blueprint for how they need to be different if they're going to help. And again, limited opportunities or options. Families may just hear the only thing they need to do is step away, or their only option is an intervention. And none of these ideas, they're often coming from places of wanting to help, but the impact of the messages often can then translate to families or those that are trying to help are somehow wrong for doing that, and they have limited options. And if they don't take these options up, they're just being less helpful in the long run. So there's a lot of narratives that families and loved ones come to the table with that may necessarily not have been helpful to them in the past. And of course, as helpers, as people trying to be there for those individuals who are struggling or families who are struggling, there's also a lot of stigma and shame that comes along with this journey. And particularly with family members thinking that they're the cause of their problem or they're the cause for not fixing it. And when we think about those relationships in the context of parenting or other family relationships, that if you have a family member who's struggling, that is a direct indication of you being bad at what you're supposed to be doing. And all these messages really just add the further weight to families and loved ones who are trying to be helpful to those that are struggling. And the net impact for that often is to undermine this very natural idea of wanting to help, that it's natural to want to try and be helpful to loved ones when they're hurting, when they're struggling. That when we see loved ones or people that we care for that are struggling, there is a natural human reaction to want to protect them from the pain and the struggles that come along with that. And as Kevin highlighted, often the outcomes are quite consequential, that we can also be talking about loss of life, incarceration, loss of housing. So when we think about the stakes, or family members or loved ones are thinking about the stakes, there's a very natural pull to want to help and protect loved ones from those experiences. And when there's stigmatization and discrimination around that, it also just compounds the problem, increases anxiety and distrustfulness of helpers or systems that could be of help. But at its core, there's a natural pull to want to hope and be hopeful and be useful. So we want to think about when you're saying, hey, and looking at that first slide, Ken, what do you mean by kindness? It's this idea of relationships, making room that it is quite normal to want to step into a relationship, to be helpful, to love those that are struggling, those that we care about, for families to want to protect those. And instead of labeling that as bad or unproductive, the idea can be, how can that kindness and the strength of relationships be brought to bear on these helping scenarios in a way of empowering families and empowering those we're working with to step into a helping space and use those caring relationships as part of the process. Often the message being that's the thing you have to leave at the door. And so as we walk together today, I want to highlight the bigger context we'll be talking about. We know that substance use has an impact on millions of people and families. We know that many people are not getting the help that they need, that families and loved ones suffer as a result of seeing their loved ones suffer. And us as helpers carry this extra weight of sitting in the suffering of others, and that's impactful. And often there's just no compass for families or others on how to go about to be helpful, nor perhaps tools that can be useful to family members to think about. But we know science and the evidence suggests there are numerous pathways to change and numerous tools and ways to think about helping that can be impactful. So we'll get a taste for them today and think about how this compass can be impactful in our own work as helpers. And if our work is also trying to help families think about how they can be impactful, to think about how these ideas can be delivered to them with an invitation to practice and working with them. Critically important to all of this, I'm just going to highlight that the invitation to change really sees helping as a process. It's not having a specific answer. It's not having the right answer at the right time. That burden of having to have the specific right answer is heavy. And it also puts a lot of pressure on the helping role. And the way I'll be talking about these ideas today is that helping is a process. It's an invitation for how family members and us as helpers can interact with those we're trying to help. It's a way of starting to think about the lenses we can bring to bear, the curiosity to understand what's going on for those individuals we're trying to help, to bring an awareness to ourselves and a compassion to ourselves in the process of helping, and to just think about how certain communication strategies and behavioral strategies can help create a condition for change. The beautiful thing about this, in a sense, when we walk together, it's kind of thinking about just having play. And each family and each circumstance is going to mold that a little differently. However, all these ideas and concepts can be brought to bear and tailored to meet the specific needs of individuals and families, which will vary. As helpers, it means we can offer lenses and engage in a set of processes, but we can take this pressure off that I have to have the perfect answer now. That's a heavy weight. And often the answers we may think are most helpful, we'll get feedback, may not be the necessarily helpful things that people find we've offered. But that's okay. We want to offer a process, a way of thinking and interacting to create conditions in which change and different outcomes can happen. So what does this process look like? And when we first started off, this process is about a set of concepts for helping individuals bring lenses to understanding their loved ones' struggles and change process. Or if we're sitting with individuals, to how we can use this to bring curiosity to our own work. What we mean by bringing awareness to the role of helping, and the communication and behavioral strategies that many of you may have run into already, but how we can think about offering that in the context of helping. The individual topics we'll touch on are these ideas of behavior making sense, that there is no one size that fits everybody, and how can we make space for how ambivalence plays out in understanding change. That when we think about awareness, we're really going to talk about bringing self-awareness and practicing that when we turn our lenses to the role of helper. And in these questions we offered in the beginning in your breakout rooms, how this ties into an idea of willingness, which is something we probably are all doing when we step into the work that we're doing. And critically important, the practice of self-compassion, which I do say is a practice. It's often not something that comes very naturally to us as human beings, nor for those that we're trying to help. And then we'll get a taste of what we mean by communication and behavioral strategies. This is the ITC model. This is the ITC houses all of the idea around the wheel here. And in the middle, you'll notice is practice. We want to just make room for the idea of the imperfections that come with learning something new and leaving space to be able to embrace that and to step in to practice learning this over time and be able to communicate that to those that we're helping. For those that want a deeper dive on the ITC, I'm just going to say, when you say, hey, Ken, what do you mean by science and kindness? The kindness is the idea of relationships matter. The power of change is in the context of caring relationships. They are a fundamental ingredient to any of the helping processes that we do. It is our relationship with those that we're helping. And in the context of families helping their loved ones, where change is more likely to happen. The science behind that is all built on years of science and understanding human motivation, the impact of positive reinforcement, how communication really matters and can be practiced, and again, the science of self-compassion. All of those ideas, motivation, reinforcement, communication, and self-compassion, have a long history of scientific study, which just says when we bring them to bear on the work we do, they can open up other possibilities and can be impactful. But the critically important is all of these come to life in the context of relationships. For those that have been operating in the space of substance use, if they say, well, does science of reinforcement and communication and compassion, hey, Ken, does that really matter when it comes to addiction and substance use? That might work in other areas, but does it really work here? Just want to say, if we do it, you roll up your sleeves when we think about evidence-based treatments that are out there in the world for substance use problems and helping families, and you all may have come into contact with all or one of these. All of these strategies are also found in community reinforcement and family training, or craft that's out there, which is a way that families can learn skills to help their loved ones. All of the work we're doing in motivational interviewing is around communication and relationship. And acceptance and commitment therapy, which is also a treatment modality out there, really keys on the idea of how do we become aware of ourselves and help others become aware of themselves? How are they relating to their emotions and thoughts? And can we help people relate to themselves a little differently to help them step into the process of change? So that's where specific examples of all these ideas live and have been applied to this particular space we're all doing our work. Okay. So if you're all open, let's just start to get acquainted with what this looks like when we step into the ITC. We're building on relationships, the power of relationships, and these specific ideas that have been found in other treatment approaches and are backed by just years of investigation. But we want to start with this idea of helping with understandings, right? It's critically important when we are bringing a lens to understand another human being, or for those that are working in the family navigator space and our family peers. The first thing we're doing is trying to offer families and those we're working with a set of lenses to understand what they're seeing, what they're experiencing. And these three set of lenses are going to be about understanding behaviors, making room for everyone who is changing, and their journey can be different, and critically important, it's not linear. There's a back and forth as part of the change process, which we just label ambivalence, which is normal in the sense of change. So these are the three understanding ideas that the ITC is offering, which can be helpful in just laying the foundation for all the other skills we're going to talk about. And this first idea of behaviors making sense is critically important. It's a fundamental anchoring set of lenses we offer individuals, because the narratives that are out there often undermine us. Often when we're in the helping role, it can be a mystery to why people are doing what they're doing. We can see individuals engaging in behaviors that seem self-destructive, can be hurtful to them, may not make sense. For family members, they can feel hurt by the behaviors of individuals. As helpers and us caring, we can see individuals we're trying to help engage in activities that can be hard to see and hard to sit with. And it can be really a challenge to put some kind of lenses to understanding it. For those that are working with families, often family members themselves have no idea about how to understand their loved one who's struggling. And the narratives out there can reinforce that. But in the ITC, we want to offer this idea that all behaviors make sense. People might be like, Ken, what do you mean by that? The fundamental anchoring perspective is that all behavior hangs around for a longer time when it serves a purpose. That even though in the context of behaviors that can have negative outcomes and negative consequences that are very real, also embedded that is that there's something positive, something useful about what people experience in their behaviors. That's another way of saying that behavior is strengthened by reinforcement. That is what keeps behaviors around. And sometimes it can be hard to see what is reinforcing, but it's an assumption we want to offer, we hold in our back pockets as helpers, and we start to have families start to think about, what could your loved one be getting out of the behavior? Even when it's hard to see that. Because if substances were just, and they offered nothing at all, except that experience of like touching a hot stove, people would have stopped. If there was nothing useful about the behavior, people would walk away from it. So this idea starts to invite a curiosity. While it might be hard for me to see, how can I start to bring a curiosity to the behaviors I'm seeing? What could a loved one or the person I'm working with be getting out of it? How can I help come to that understanding? And one way we can think about this is just this exercise. If I was hanging out with you in person in a room and just said, hey, I have something that I can offer you that can chill you out, maybe take some depression away, feel good, maybe take away some boredom, help you with physical pain, perhaps make you excited about your day, impact your personality, help you lose weight. All of these ideas. Is there anything looking at these outcomes that is inherently bad or wrong? You can feel free to chat that out. Just looking at this list, is there anything wrong with anything on this list? In fact, often when people look at this list, they say, no, actually, just on the surface of this, these can seem like desirable outcomes that almost everybody wants at some point of time in their life. And it's interesting because when you survey and ask people, bring a curiosity to what are some of the things you get out of substance use, the reasons almost look identical. That when people are asked to really think and are asked to describe, okay, yes, true, there are things that aren't working about this. But when you push into it, what are some of the things that make this desirable for you? We see that the reasons very much map on what are considered and often the very things most humans want. So this kind of idea starts to invite us to think and help those that we may be helping in terms of other contexts. Let's bring a curiosity. That let's start to understand what could be useful about this, because often these conversations are not necessarily the conversations that are always engaged in, but start to shift perspective. And this quote kind of grabs that. If I approach behaviors or help families start to think about behaviors, not so much about the drinking per se. Yes, that's there. We're not ignoring that. But what could be behind that? What's the thirst? What's the curiosity? This starts to bring life to that saying that behaviors make sense. Not that they're not scary behaviors, not that these behaviors don't have consequences, but can we bring a different set of lenses first as a first step to understand what's behind the behavior? What's that reinforcement? Shifts a way that can be helpful in a lot of ways to open up doors for different conversations and different ideas for helping. If I start to understand your thirst. And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to reshare this just to make sure, is it also creates a bigger context to understand the behavior. What happens if I bring a curiosity to understanding a bigger idea, what's behind your behavior? It broadens my view, and that can be powerful. And I hope this video just speaks to this from a different angle of what can we get out, or what can we provide those we're helping to start thinking of the thirst or what's behind the behavior. In other words, placing it in a context. This video has some talking, so if it's low, you can turn your volume up.
Imagine this scenario. You're walking down the side of a two-way street when you look up and see a person trying to cross. There's plenty of traffic and you can hear cars and trucks whooshing by. The person you noticed looks impatient, upset, frantic, and does not seem to be considering the danger ahead of them. Instead, all they seem to be concerned about is getting to the other side of the street. Take a moment to consider the following. What are your thoughts and feelings about this person and their behavior? And what are some actions that those thoughts and feelings make you want to take? You may be thinking, what's wrong with them? What's making them crazy enough to try and cross traffic without thinking? Are they dangerous? You may be feeling scared for what's about to happen, anxious for the person you're watching, and confused by their behavior. Some actions you may want to consider include moving away from the situation by leaving so you don't have to see the person get hurt, or engaging in the situation by yelling at them to stop to try to promote a positive outcome. Continue imagining the same scenario, only now I'll give you a little bit more information. Before you saw this person, they had been driving further down the road with their dog in the back seat. At a stoplight, the dog jumped out of the car and began running through traffic. The person is now frantically trying to get the dog back inside of the car before it gets hurt. Now take a moment to consider the following. What are your thoughts and feelings about this person after learning about their reason for trying to cross such a busy street? What are some actions those thoughts and feelings make you want to take? You might be thinking, how can I help this person? How do I keep him safe when he's upset and not thinking about his own safety? You might be feeling compassion, sadness for the person's situation, and fear it might go badly. You may be more inclined to take action by offering to help, calling for more help, or trying to intervene in some way. The purpose of this exercise is to show that when another person's behavior seems irrational or erratic or scary in some way, in the way that substance use often does, it can push us into a "let me get away from this" or "make it stop" response, and make us want to move away from it entirely. It can be hard to see how to be helpful in these situations or to even want to help, while also experiencing our own set of thoughts and emotions as a bystander. By taking a moment to put the behaviors into a larger context, by understanding the why behind their behavior, we can start to make sense of the motivation behind them. We can then decide on a productive way to move forward. So let's think back to the scenario we just imagined. If we start off deciding that the person running in the road is doing it just because they're crazy, then we are also limiting ourselves from seeing the full picture. This way of thinking is natural, but does not facilitate positive action on our part. Instead, if we decide that the person trying to cross the road has a valid or a sympathetic reason for their behavior, we open ourselves up to more understanding. We can now accept new information and learn that the person is trying to find their dog. This information will most likely shift our thoughts and emotions surrounding the behavior, and we'll then be able to come up with, and want to come up with, a productive plan on how to help them. Finally, let's put this all in the context of substance use. If we decide that a person who is using substances is doing so just because they are an addict, aka a morally bankrupt, irresponsible person, we will very effectively shut out information that could help us understand their behaviors. And without that understanding, we won't be able to find a constructive way to offer support. However, if we open ourselves up to understanding that all behaviors make sense, we will learn that people use substances for valid reasons. Examples could include using substances to ease anxiety, feel more ready to handle daily life, or get to sleep despite physical pain. This type of information will then help us begin moving forward by supporting our loved ones in a productive way.
I invite you all to chat any questions or reactions you have. Some of these questions you may also, and that curiosity you bring to your work. Our reason starting here, the why behind the what, starts to bring a different perspective that sometimes is lost in the greater narrative, which is we're focusing on the behavior. And we have labels that supposedly explain it. But what we can lose sight, or if our work is helping in the family space, what families can feel like they can ask is to understand the curiosity. What's behind the behavior? How can we start to at least understand it as a first step? And by placing it in that bigger context, it starts to open up some doors for thinking about, if I were going to help, what's the landscape going to look like? Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Heather, for your comments. So our first stop is, can we bring this curiosity? The assumption is this behavior you're engaging in is there for a reason. It may be hard for me to see that reason, but if I'm assuming that it's making sense in some way to you, it gives me permission to bring that curiosity and start to try to understand that with you. Help me understand what you're getting out of it. And that starts to open up different conversations. If the behavior doesn't, some of the skills will make sense in that sense. Some of the skills will be talking about the use of communication, the understanding, really is stemming from this principle that your substance use, your loved one's substance use is serving a purpose. Let's try to figure out what that is. Not that we have to know it, not that we'll be experts at getting it, but we have the invitation to start to operate with that curiosity. But there's an implication to that. If I say, okay, your substance use is serving a purpose for you, you're getting something there. What you may be getting out of it could be different than what someone else is getting out of it. In other words, what brings you in to this behavior can be quite different across people. And since you are different, your journey out, your pathway to change can also look different. So the second level of understanding we can bring to our work, and for those when we're working with families, if that's the space we're in, or working with loved ones or trying to help things, something we can offer is your loved one's journey can look different than the journey of other people you know with the same struggles. One size does not fit all. Right? Again, that's not always the narrative that's out there. Our language can handcuff and put everybody in the same bucket. And we've heard things that are out in that narrative that make everybody almost the same. Addicts are all the same. When we use labels for people, we're kind of taking away their individual circumstances. Well, we can pin it on their addictive personality or other labels for families. Or sometimes the narratives that tell families or tell individuals, they only have one choice. They either have to take this path to change or they're not going to change. Right? So the compass that's given, or the compass as helpers we're given, is almost like you have to get the person to take this one road. Yet, that's not necessarily what's supported out there. Some roads are helpful, suggestions are helpful, yet can we make room and start to entertain? If I'm understanding what you're getting out of this, I'm also seeing you as an individual, your unique circumstances, and that can help me think and partner with you about what particular road will be most useful to you. And when we embrace this idea of one size not fitting all, we're really embracing the idea that behavior is really complex. And we swim in that water as helpers all the time. We know that what makes people tick, the circumstances surrounding people's journeys and struggles, can involve so many different factors. But we can just acknowledge that complexity and acknowledge the many roads in and out of change that we also know science has backed. People's changing, the way they change is quite different. But we know if we're allowed and offer people options to the extent we can, when options are provided, people are more likely to connect with a pathway that's most helpful to them and most in line with the direction they want to go. And again, it's not saying suggestions are wrong per se, but what we're saying is I can see you as an individual and I would like to be thoughtful with you about what pathways and scaffolding is going to be most useful given your circumstances. By adopting that perspective, we're just leveraging and offering to those we're helping and the families we're helping that there are different ways to help. So that is hopeful. If one particular strategy or way of being is not necessarily gaining traction, we know there are other strategies that can be brought into play. It allows families and individuals the freedom to know that they can go about changing connected to their values. Because often the messaging, if you're only given one road that doesn't align, that you have to drop what's important to you to take that road. That's built in some flexibility here for ways of being creative and thinking about how the change process can happen. And doesn't jam people into a corner, which we'll talk about when it comes to ambivalence. Often as human beings, and we all know that, when we're pushed into a corner, we can dig our heels in and push back, just as an instinctive move. So it's a way of not pushing people in a way that shuts them down. And how does this look in the questions we can ask? Well, often talking with families or talking in the way with those that we're helping, we can bring a sense of curiosity in these conversations. Well, what options do people think would be helpful to their loved one or to themselves when they think of change? Knowing what we know about their particular circumstances. What are some of the ingredients that could be helpful in building that scaffolding? What resources might be available that readily align with the values of a loved one? Thinking creatively about what behaviors would have to be brought into play if people were going to step away from this behavior that on some level might be useful to them. And what could be some of the challenges that come along with people stepping away from behaviors that they still perhaps get something out of? Notice it's not coming up with a specific answer, but in this space, the one size doesn't fit all allows for conversations that build in some flexibility and some collaborative approach to thinking about what could these roads look like, given the values and given the circumstances, the context of each individual. And building in that freedom and collaboration allows for some buy-in that may not be there if only one option is given to an individual. And in your handouts, this particular set of questions are on page 3. It's something to think about how we can bring that curiosity and collaborativeness into the work in the context and space that we're interacting with loved ones or trying to help families entertain and think about how they want to talk with their loved ones. Okay. I don't have a visual of everybody, but certainly is this pace so far going okay? A thumbs up, thumbs down, you can chat if you have questions on any of these. Okay, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Lori. Hi, and Dad, and Heather. Hi, Sean. Thank you. Again, we're here in this space of understanding. Can we bring a curiosity to behaviors that seem complicated, that can be scary to see, but still leave space for finding the reinforcement? Helping people think about how to have those conversations, creating a little space for conversations about, given what you know about your loved one, or given what you know about those that you're helping and what's important to them, can we think collaboratively about what pathways seem like they'd be the most helpful to you? Right? Again, bringing that curiosity. The third part of understanding, either in our own work as helpers or trying to help families, is that we know change can be tough. We know that motivation is not necessarily an on and off switch. It's kind of more like the tide. There are days motivation is high tide. People really can think about change. And there are times when motivation can be low tide. And that can be scary to think about change, or people can decide not to change. And while that can be a normal part of the process, that can be really frustrating for those that are trying to help individuals. That could be really scary for loved ones that we're all excited about the high motivation times, but are feeling discouraged or hopeless when there's the low tide of motivation. But here what we want to talk about is this idea of ambivalence. And as I step into that, I see Kevin's hand up, and we have time. Kevin, why don't you ask a question? I do want to apologize to people if I see your hand up and I just keep trucking along. It will be just balancing, leaving room for Q&A at the end versus the questions throughout. But we're at a transition point. So Kevin, what's your question?
No, I was just going to say that it's very important to make those times where you see like a slight change, to highlight those times, because it's a very delicate situation for people, and change is not always easy. That's all I was going to say.
That's beautifully said, Kevin, and I agree. Like, as you're talking, it's the idea of, like you said, they're delicate, right? They're important times, and I'll build on what Kevin just put out there. But that idea of watering, growing flowers, that idea of recognizing change in those steps is really critically important because often they can be missed. And important for us as helpers, if our space is to try to help families, it's helping them see those steps too that sometimes can be missed. Because change is hard and it's back and forth. And look, Madison Avenue cashes in on that just by this receipt, right? Purchase any 6 lean cuisine entries in a single order, and on your way out, don't forget to pick up that 56-ounce container of ice cream. Right? Ambivalence is part of being human, and people, when they're entertaining change, can be pulled in 2 directions. One towards making change, and yet some of those behaviors that are practiced and serve a purpose can always have a voice. And not that that's a failure of the human condition, that doesn't mean people don't want to make change, as this receipt just highlights. As human beings, we can be of 2 minds about things, and we can experience a back and forth and tug of war as we're engaging in the change process. But importantly, I'm going to say ambivalence is the part of the change process, but notice how that can be left out of the narratives. And I think as Kevin mentioned, often people's narratives can position them to miss those steps of change that are occurring. And some of the narratives of what parents experience or loved ones experience or helpers in the helping space can experience is when they see ambivalence, it's, well, they're just not ready to change. They don't want it, or they're lying. Yesterday they said they wanted to change. Today they're engaging in old behaviors. They're just liars. Or the backsliding is really just denial. If they could actually see the negative consequences, they wouldn't be ambivalent. But we want to reposition that narrative. We want to offer a new perspective here. And the perspective is that ambivalence is the expected part of change. There are reasons. Again, I want to tie this to behaviors make sense. If we really adopt that, then what we're asking people to do, and loved ones are asking their loved ones to do, is step away from a behavior that, even though in some ways it's not working in circumstances, in other ways it still is. So that creates a little bit of a conflict to say goodbye to a behavior that's been meaningful or useful. But if that's the change process, when we see ambivalence in that back and forth, that's just a sign that people are struggling with 2 mindsets, a mindset of making change and a mindset of having to say goodbye to something that was useful to them. And that's part of being human in a lot of ways. So we position this understanding that ambivalence is normal. Critically, change is new behaviors that are stepping into the space that sit along old behaviors. And really important here, and I will highlight this, is that change happens by addition, particularly with behavior change. We can't erase behaviors we've learned, but we can learn new behaviors on top of old behaviors. And that part of bringing in new behaviors is the change process. The wrinkle it causes is that the old behaviors at times can still have a voice. So if I see you changing by bringing new behaviors in, as Kevin mentioned, I want to support the growth of those new behaviors because that's the change process. That's change in motion. And we see it as helpers. We can see people's struggles with the back and forth. If we're working in the family space as peer family support, we're trying to help families orient and know that ambivalence is not necessarily a bad thing. It is the process of change unfolding. And importantly, as MI teaches us, that how people experience the ambivalence is critically dependent on how those that are around them are also responding to ambivalence. And we're going to step into an exercise to highlight that. But ambivalence not only is something experienced internally, it's something people experience based on how the people around them are reacting. And often we can say the common reaction people have when seeing individuals with ambivalence is to want to talk more sense into them, to talk more forcefully or strongly, to try to drive through or break through, as some people would say, denial. But we just want to think a little differently about it in this space, which is if you're ambivalent, I understand you have two perspectives here. So how I'm going to engage you in your conversation is going to either push you further away from change and let the old behaviors get stronger, or invite you to walk towards the change process, which may give those new behaviors a voice. And that's really what we're thinking about with ambivalence, that there's two voices. I want to change, and I like what I have. And it's that tug of war that is really at the crux of people entertaining the change process. And how we react and respond to each voice is critically important in the helping role. So we're going to do a practice here as a breakout. We're going to break out into rooms of 4. And here's my invitation to everybody. This is an exercise on just different ways of having conversations, different ways of listening in the space of someone being ambivalent. So I'm going to go through the script. You also have it in your handout on page 4. We'll send it out for those that want to take a picture of it also. When you get in your rooms of 4, you're each going to be asked to take a role. And you don't have to, debate about it long. I just say, if anybody wants to take the speaker role, this is going to be your script. For those that take the speaker role, I'm just going to ask you for about 90 seconds or 2 minutes, just describe something about yourself or in your life that you've thought about wanting to change, but just haven't done it yet. Again, not a deep dive. I'm not asking you to reveal something extremely personal, but just something that perhaps you entertained. If you have a client, you want to use that scenario, that's fine as well. Just say, this is what I've been thinking about. This is what I've been looking to try to make a change, and I haven't. Okay? So something you're ambivalent about. When people divvy up the roles, we've got speaker. I'm going to ask someone to take listener 1. So someone just volunteer to be listener 1, and this will be your script. After the person speaks for 90 seconds, I'm just going to ask you to kind of tell the speaker some things based on your perspective. After they say, tell them why it's important that they make change. Maybe give them a reason of what could happen if they don't make this change. And from the listener 1 perspective, perhaps how they could go about or should go about making this change. So this is listener 1's script. Tell the speaker why it's important to change, what could happen if they don't, how they can go about doing it. Do that for about 2 minutes. Just deliver that to the speaker. So we got a speaker role, we got listener 1. I'm going to ask someone to take listener 2 role. Here's your listener 2 script. Listener 2, your job, so to speak, is just engage the speaker a little differently. Just ask the speaker what could happen if they don't change and listen. Ask them why it's important for them to make the change. Just listen. Perhaps what their most important reason is for making change. And how they could go about making the change. So notice you're asking them these questions and just asking them to respond. Okay. 2 different listening styles, listener 1 style, listener 2. And for those groups that have 4, someone just take an observer role. And I ask you just to watch the interactions. Notice how the speaker is responding to each of the listening styles, and perhaps just highlight something that stood out to you as part of the interactions. Perhaps how the speaker was, perhaps how the listeners came across. We're all coming back. We did a little exercise in breakout rooms. I appreciate everybody's patience with getting the assignments and stepping into it. And I just wanted to check in with to start, anyone who was in the speaker role. Thought, what was the experience like with two different listening styles? Anybody want to share?
Yeah, I was a speaker, and to hear from two different people with two different perspectives was good. Was good. I was actually working on changing my diet because my sugar's going high. I'm pre-diabetic. So I got some good information from both listeners.
Okay. So even though, Kevin, there were two different styles, the way it was delivered, both styles seemed to be helpful to you.
Both of them were very helpful.
Okay. Thanks for highlighting that. Benita, I saw your hand go up before. So
yes, I have to kind of agree with Kevin. Harley was the speaker one who asked me why, what was it important, what could happen if I made the changes and so on, which made me really think about it. And she gave great suggestions on how I can begin. My thing was exercise or lack of exercise. So she gave some good feedback and suggestions, as well as Dale said, what would happen if I don't make the changes? Which I already knew the answers to all of that, why it's a struggle. And they both gave very, very good suggestions and how I can get started in making the change or help me to make the decision on how to begin the process of starting exercise. Gave me a little more clarity. Yeah.
That was interesting. You said the one thing, some of them you already had answers for. So under the right questions, you were able to kind of voice out loud the answers you had. It's not that you didn't have any expertise in this. This is all, like you said, it was your thing. So you've given thought to this. You both highlighted the styles, although being different, the delivery was impactful. Of the two, for people out there, of the two styles, which one was more about kind of asking you as the speakers, or for people when you're noticing the speaker, which one invited the speaker to give their opinion more? A listener one or listener two?
Listener two. Listener one is all of the you're not asking, you're telling, and listener two is asking the person to come up with things on their own first.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, so stylistically, listener one was more about giving information, right? Statements, and as Rachel highlighted, listener two used those kind of open questions, open-ended questions to pull out, to invite you as speakers to talk about it. Now, I want to, everybody's highlighted the relationship is important because how they were delivered mattered. But we could think also about maybe situations where people are more frustrated or people have less patience or a history of having conflict where these styles could feel differently versus someone coming at telling what should be done versus one asking questions to pull out the expertise that the speaker already has. Any other, curious, and we're going to build on those open-ended questions from listener two later. But I appreciate everyone highlighting that delivery is important. And Rachel, your hand is up still, or?
Yeah, keep clapping to raise my hand.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Well, I mean, yeah, you're doing great though. I just want to say that, like, in our group, the second set of skills, the second set of questions, the speaker often returned back to what they had been told in the first set listening questions. And like for me, my goals were self-care. And just for me personally, if someone like a therapist or doctor is telling me, well, you could do this or this or this or this, unless I say with the first person pronoun, I need to do this, which is harder, I think, than just listening to somebody tell you what to do. And then, like you said, use your own expertise. But I think that pronoun ownership of coming up with it yourself and actually saying it out loud can be really powerful. That's what I just want to say that.
Well, thank you for that. And stylistically, I think as we're highlighting, perspective advice has its place. But as we note here, and we come back around to just thinking about this collaborative effort, there is a stylistic difference certainly between those questions of how and what versus telling. So we'll build on that. Why we introduce this particular exercise around ambivalence is because sometimes in the face of ambivalence, when an individual is being told what they should be doing, they may wind up inadvertently siding with the "I'm not going to change" voice instinctively. And notice listener 2, by asking questions, wasn't siding with necessarily directly the ambivalence, but just inviting in the speaker to talk out loud about their view of the situation and to entertain possibilities. As Rachel noticed, there's more of an active I component in there, in that process. Thank you, everybody. You have that in your handouts, and we'll come back around to listener 2 style in a little bit. And I know we'll be covering a lot of topics. We started with understanding the science behind reinforcement and what's the motivation behind behaviors, the one size, the flexibility, or the many roads in and out. That's part of the change process across people. And that change involves this idea of ambivalence, which is expected part of change. Yet when we're sitting in conversations with individuals who may be ambivalent, important to think about the tone and the style by which we're having those conversations, because they impact how people are going to relate to their own kind of tug of war of change. And as Kevin and Benita highlighted too, depending on the deliveries, both styles have their place, although one style may be a little bit more collaborative. And as Rachel noted, there's an active part for the person speaking when they're being asked about their expertise in themselves. Let's show, well, I'm going to make sure my sound is on, so I apologize for jumping out of this. We're going to move to, well, if we're helping people and we're adopting this set of lenses and these ideas behind behaviors making sense and seeing the person in context, being mindful of ambivalence, that first exercise when you're all talking, just kind of like about what's challenging about being a helper. We highlight because there's nothing about the helping role, either when we wear a hat as peer specialists, as counselors, when we wear a hat as family members, that divorces or removes us from the experience of being a helper. And what's challenging, what's tough, what are the hard things about helping come along with that journey of stepping into the helping space. So in the ITC, one thing we want to orient people towards is this idea of self-awareness, that helping doesn't necessarily mean forgetting about ourselves as helpers. Our experiences are part of that role. And one way we can think about it is this video I'm going to show you. And I'll talk about the very end where I have a different opinion to that, but it does capture the messaging that's off there. But also, I think just the real challenge of being a caring helper and stepping into that space when individuals are struggling and we're journeying with them to help them during that process. So this is going to be a video of a teacher who's just talking to her class about a story. It's just words and piano music. Please feel free to chat your ideas about that. There's something for me that we can think about the role of helping that often we know change doesn't happen overnight. And if we had time to sit and just talk about all the work that we do as a community here and sitting with individuals in their change process, we know it can be a journey. It can be a marathon for those that we're trying to help, a marathon for family members or loved ones who are walking that journey with their loved one. And certainly a marathon, for the relationships and the miles that we are willing to walk with others in their journey. So that video, I think, for me, captures the idea that it's not necessarily the weight of the glass, but what happens when we're asked to connect with something that's very important to us, that glass, and we're holding on to it. But we're holding on to it not just for a minute, but for long periods of time. The weight of that glass, the weight of that experience certainly is going to feel different for the duration on which we're staying connected to that process. Often the narrative is how that ended. It's important just to let go the strains and stresses that bother you, as if there's a magic switch to let go of it, to turn it off, or to invite families to just turn it off. Or for us as helpers, when we're working with people and experiencing really tough things as part of our work, to just shut it off. So the question is not so much about just letting it go, but it comes to how do we put scaffolding around our arms or help those that are trying to help, scaffolding around that arms that allows them to hold on to these very important things and bear the weight of that over time. So when we think about helping with awareness in the ITC, this is where the self-care, the self-awareness process comes in to bear. It's not about inviting people to just let go of their stresses and worries. It's the idea to connect with their experiences. And then through that connection to think about how work and the journey can remain meaningful and how the practice of relating to those experiences can shift over time. But we have to start somewhere. And where we start with that is just the practice of self-awareness, which often is something that we have the least time for, or in working with family members, will say they have the least time for. I've got a million things on my plate. What do you mean, slow down and become aware of what's going on? But that very skill, that first step in which, what does it mean to slow down and make room to check in for what am I feeling in this moment? What do I notice my mind telling me in this moment, in these circumstances? How do I experience the weight of the work I'm doing? Do I experience it in my thoughts? Is it my emotions? Do I experiencing it physically in sense of fatigue or stomach issues or tightness in my neck or the body sensations that show up? Or when I'm working with family members, do they talk about urges to overcompensate and always stay on the go, to never want to slow down? Or me as a helper in my work, do I always feel I'm on the go constantly? And it feels weird to not be on the go. There's a lot of individual variability in self-awareness, and we all kind of relate to this differently. But this first step of helping and stepping into the role as helper is having permission to bring that set of lenses to that role, which is, as a helper, what are my experiences? And in your handout, we have an exercise called Let Me Count the Ways. It's a worksheet. You can keep this in your back pocket if you'd like. You can look at this on the screen. But what I'm going to ask all of you is, even in this space as we sit here, if you were to take 30 seconds and think about your role of helper, think about all the things you're doing. When you think about stepping into that role, what are one or two things that are just hard for you and that show up for you when you take on that role? Notice that question was offered in the beginning when we were in our breakout rooms, but let's come back to that. Just one or two things about what comes along with my role of holding that glass. How do I experience that? And how do I relate or rate that on a scale from 1 to 5? Is it a passing aching in my arm? Or do I notice some things that really can overwhelm me? And just to make room to entertain that thought. And you can feel free if you want to chat your responses there. As TJ talks about auto drive. Right, and Heather highlights that, the normalness of it. We can habituate to it, just make it part of our bandwidth. Yet it's not a zero weight. Well, in this exercise, some of the questions that can entertain for yourself as you just look at what you wrote down or thought about, noticing what shows up for you when you just acknowledge those challenges. How does your mind relate to that? Does it say you're wasting time? Does it judge you for that? Does it try to push it away? How often do you allow yourself to check in with yourself just about what I experienced today while I was holding that glass? Do you tell others about how it is to hold that glass, or are you one to just hold that in silence, keep it to yourself? And when you think of those that you're helping, do they tend to do that in silence? And I do see I'm talking about being positive. If we bring positivity there and having to make that, there's place for that. Is there also room to be able to allow oneself to be human and just embrace the experiences that come with those roles and the weight of that? We position these questions, this worksheet that you can keep as well, depending on your work with others. It can be useful to just slow things down and often invite people to just think about these questions in their role as helper. For us to entertain these questions as helpers, it allows that acknowledgement that helping is holding a glass for a long time. And that brings this weight. And the duration and the time we do that is important. Because often these questions, this awareness is kind of brushed aside. But in this context, one thing I want to highlight, not only is self-awareness about identifying what's hard, what shows up for me as a helper, what's the experiences that come along with this. Is also the other question we talked about in the beginning, which was, what's important to me behind that? What's my why for stepping into that space? I can think about that in my role as a helper. When I sit and talk with others, I can invite them to talk about this awareness, not only of the weight of the glass, but what's important about holding on to the glass. Another way to think about this is just this discussion of values, which can be critically important in this idea of self-care, which is first, what are my values? What brings me to the table here? What matters to me as a person? A lot of ways to think about it. We could think about it in terms of a North Star. We can think about it in terms of values. We can think about it in terms of, for some people, thinking about a lighthouse that's on the shore. So that in moments of tough times, we can orient back to why is it meaningful for me to be in this role? Because we can lose track of that at times. It can seem far away. But self-awareness is also part of that, noticing what matters and making room to think about that. What matters to me as a helper? If we're working with family members, what matters to me in my role with my loved one? Some people say, well, how do I help people have that conversation? How do I help people think about their values? And there's a lot of different exercises we could spend time on. This, I just want to highlight one for you. Sometimes values are hard to find because we can have what others tell us should be important to us. So it's really others' values that come to mind when we think about that. Or we can have multiple values and it can get confusing. But one exercise sometimes is if we cut space to think about just this idea of we were going to our 80th birthday party and we were sitting in the presence of those we're helping, those that we're journeying with. What qualities of our actions would we want those that we're helping to experience? So if they were going to talk at our 80th birthday party, what would we want them to get up and say about us? How they experienced us? What they found useful in our presence in their life? How we would want them to talk about us? These kind of questions, if we sit down and start to think about it, can help us get, or if we're working with others, help people to think about, how do I want others to experience me? What's important to me as a helper? What qualities do I want to bring in my interactions to those that I'm helping? If I can start to flesh that out, I can think about, am I stepping into the world today in my role in a way that brings honor to the way I want to be seen as a helper? Or am I drifting from that? Is the weight of the glass somehow pulling me away from the way I want to be experienced? Right, this exercise, this idea starts to help flesh out the importance, the values. What's the why behind my what? Also critically important in self-awareness. Well, why would we want to entertain this idea of the weight of the glass, how it's experienced in the role of helping, and help to put some shed on values? How do we use that in our work, or how do we help others use those sense of awareness in their relationships? And it's going to strike around this idea of willingness. And in awareness, the idea that in a world where we could just have one of these ideas, that when you look at these circles, if you vote on one circle, what matters in my relationship with those that are struggling or those that are helpful? And that other circle, what is uncomfortable and painful or hard about being helpful to others? And you wrote words there. You may see something like this on one circle. Perhaps being connected is important, or I want to be respectful or collaborative or kind. I want to bring hopefulness or positivity. And some of the difficulty things that could be experienced is fear or confusion or fatigue, embarrassed. But if I asked all of you, in a world where you could have just one, which circle would you grab? You can chat, you can shout it out. Which one would you just reach out for and hold on to in a world where you could have one? TJ, the first circle. Number one, Sandra, yes, right? The pleasant one, thank you. Alicia, thank you. Yeah, we're building a consensus here, right? Yeah, thanks. And that makes total sense, right? I'm right with all of you. Give me that one. That's where the important stuff is. That's the way I want to be. Those are where my values reside. So of course, in a world with one, we can have that. However, if the world's invitation is different, and the world says they're not separate sides, but both of these are a side on the same coin, the choice becomes different. It's not about holding which side we want. The ask starts to become, if I'm going to pick up the coin and hold the sides that's important, am I willing to also experience what might be on the other side of that coin? Because they travel together. And why we position and start to entertain this idea of willingness is because often the human condition can have us to want to just have one side of that coin because it's alluring. And we can spend, or families that we work with, if that's in our space, can spend all this time trying to separate the sides, or saying, I'm going to wait for that side that I don't want to clear out before I pick up that one important side. But often that's a very hard thing to accomplish. And the humanness of helping and stepping in is more about, as I pick up the side that's helpful to me, can I make room for what shows up in my experience that might not be as pleasant? In other words, part of being aware and part of bringing care is this invitation is, how do I want to open up and adopt a willingness stance? For those that want to stay connected to loved ones who are struggling, can I find the values behind that? the values of wanting to be seen and experienced in a certain way because it's helpful and important to me as a helper. But also be mindful and make room for some of the challenges that come along with that. And not try to wrestle them away or make them go away, but just make a little room and awareness for all that shows up as I step into that helping role. Because it's human nature to just want one side. And by wanting just the good side, people can get pulled into trying to control the other person to make those scariness, those pain go away. Trying to shut down as a helper to not experience those aspects of the coin. Or to just say, you know what, I'm going to step away from my values here because I don't want to experience the uncomfortability that comes with that. And it's not a right or wrong, but willingness is, again, that question. Can I make room for my experiences because it's in the service of me moving towards what I value? And as Dale noted, it's about balance. Balance meaning both the valued and the challenging aspects of my experience can come together. It's not an either or proposition. And in some way, willingness, the idea of trying to take meaningless suffering and bringing it in the service of what's important and what's of value. The self-awareness allows us to start thinking about willingness. It's like, what do I do with this clarity of my values? What do I do with this clarity of what it feels like to step into this challenging role? And in your worksheets, which I'll show you, is when we bring this into action, when we bring values and awareness together, it allows this practice for ourselves, but also for those we're trying to help, to think about this idea of a pause button. That when we become aware of difficult experiences and we get pulled into reactionary mode, we can start to use our awareness to slow down, to notice what's showing up for us, to check in with our values and say, how do I want to step into this moment? And into a practice stepping in that direction. It doesn't always come naturally, it's a practice, but it helps take away reactionary mode and start to help to step into responding mode, which is a little different. Responding is a little bit more values driven than reactionary mode. And this can be critically helpful for also families and other members that we're trying to help think about how they're responding to their loved ones while they're holding that class. And willingness isn't instinctive, it's a practice. So this pause button exercise that you have in your handout is an exercise that anyone can go through to think about their being aware strategies. How do they know what's showing up? Is it in their emotions, in their attention? What are pause strategies they can bring into play? How do they slow things down? Is it taking a walk? Is it having a certain phrase, a certain visual, a certain person they can talk to? And then as they pause and they find what's important, to be able to make that decision, what do I want to use to guide my response in this situation? So by putting this in the PDF we'll hold on to, I invite you to think about maybe even as a helper, some of the moments that you felt really pulled and have been difficult, and to even walk through this in your own thoughtful moments about what are my aware strategies, what are my pause strategies, and how do I bring my values into the moment? That can be helpful. This framework can also be built upon for those that are coaching others. When people are feeling like they respond in a reactionary mode and they wind up reacting in ways that they feel are not their best versions of themselves, this can be a useful set of exercises to start that conversation. bringing awareness and values to bear on the moment. But the practice of all of that is important. And one thing I want to highlight is we think about this self-awareness. Awareness is useful if we can use it to find our values and know what our experiences are. It can be useful if it provides a compass for stepping into those moments in a more thoughtful way. And we're not going to be perfect, right? And the people and the individuals we're trying to help are also not going to get it right all the time. So people could always be and have come back. I get so mad at myself. I get down on myself. I can really beat myself up in those moments where I'm responding in ways that I wish I could respond differently. So one thing we highlight in the ITC in the self-care and awareness is this practice of self-compassion, which can get sticky because not everybody likes it. There's all kinds of associations with it, but we want to highlight the science behind it and the idea that self-compassion is bringing awareness to our experiences and helping others bring awareness to their experiences. To step out of isolation, to make room for their experiences and stay present with themselves in ways that can promote longer journeys. It's just not forgetting troubles, and it's just not pampering oneself or just engaging in activities that feel good in the moment. It could be some of that. But ultimately, it's three major ingredients that can be practiced. Having patience for ourselves is a practice. There are times when we probably have shorter fuses with ourselves as helpers than anyone else around us. So this idea of bringing kindness versus judging ourselves is important, and helping others start to practice that. Noticing, this is where self-awareness comes in. That's my critical script. That's my judgmental mind. That's when I start beating myself. I can start to notice that practice. And if I notice it, I can step back from it a little bit. I cannot buy into it. The other ingredient in practice is this idea of seeing oneself as a human being. Often, the narratives out there is to see myself less than others, be more critical with myself than the criticalness or the way I am with others. So this idea of, as human beings, we are connected in our humanness. And that means the imperfections that come with our humanness. But if I can start to see that or talk with others to practice that perspective, it starts to take the bite out of some of the judgmental chatter that can come along with trying new things and not being perfect at that. And the practice of self-awareness allows me to be present with myself, not trying to scold myself for having painful thoughts or emotions. But as Dale said, bringing a balance to this. We're not trying to just let our troubles go, but if I can bring my awareness to it, I can say, okay, there's a reason for these experiences. They're here. That doesn't make me less than. That actually makes me a complete human. And I can think about different ways of responding to that in a way that supports my role as helper. And for those that I'm trying to also help, can support their role in that process. It's a practice. Nothing in the awareness bin comes naturally. So I want to highlight that and give a taste for what does the ITC means about self-care. It's the combination of bringing awareness, finding values, allowing both values to guide responding, and to practice self-compassion. If we're able to help individuals do that and we start to bring those practices to ourselves, the weight of that glass can feel, the experience of holding that glass for long periods of times can start to shift. Any questions up to this point? I know I'm touching on a lot of bases to give you an overview of the model. And I do recognize it's a lot of information. My invitation here is not to walk away thinking you need to have memorized everything or be an expert on this. This is you to leave here with a map of these ideas and concepts can be something you can go back to and start to think about and how you want to bring it into your work as a helper. But any questions or comments up to this point before we go to that action part of this model?
Hello, my comment is more on the fact that you were saying that we have to be kind to ourselves and the idea of bringing that into practice. And I think sometimes it's very challenging for you in the helping field because sometimes you are having to reassess yourself and say, what could I have done different? Maybe I should have done this different. Maybe I should have done that different. But really allowing yourself to be kind that and bringing that also into meeting with a client. I really like this idea because I'm usually doing the opposite. And at times I find that I tend to be very hard on myself when clients are reporting the opposite, like, Ms. Sandra, I did get it. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Sandra. And I thank you for your humanness and putting that out there that often, and this is where I think that self-compassion idea as a skill comes from is right. Our tendencies as humans to be very critical. And there's a fine line there between saying, let me look at how maybe I can do things differently. And I can think about that. And we probably have examples of ways that if we were sitting and speaking with someone to help us get better at something, the characteristics they would bring. And then that fine line of saying, not only am I going to think about how I can do things differently, but then my mind stepping in and saying, not only that, but now I'm going to judge you. I'm going to critique you. I'm going to tell you about weaknesses here. I'm going to tell you things and judge you for trying that. And that's this fine line between saying I can do better here, I can grow, I'm a human, versus that judgmental chatter that can find its way in and speak differently to us. So thank you so much for highlighting that. Kevin.
Yeah, I was just gonna say I like the part, the self-awareness and self-care portion, because I need to remind myself that although I'm in this challenging field, there's a lot that I'm still learning. And I'm not gonna get everything right, overnight, but over time. So, at the end of the day, and one of the things I'm learning how to do is to not take what happens on the job home, that extra stress, allowing myself to say, listen, this is okay for now. We'll come back and we'll challenge it tomorrow, but let's go have a great evening. Because there were times when I was employed where I did carry the work as well as the stress home, and it affected my relationships.
Right. Thanks for sharing that, Kevin. So important. And you're highlighting that critical ingredient, which I think is that spirit, which is, and it's not like a switch, like you said, it's something to work at. It's not like I can just hit that off button and bam, but it's like you're bringing mindfulness and awareness to that. This is what I know I'm carrying. How can I try to just relate to that differently? So thank you so much. Leslie.
Yes, good afternoon. I just want to chime in on what Kevin was just saying. Sometimes it's hard to not take work home. Especially if you care about your participants, you care about your clients. It is so hard sometimes to not take it home with you. But the thing that I found that works best for me is I try not to dwell on it. Of course, I'm going to take it with me because it's part of who I am. But I try my best not to dwell on the issues that my participants, that my clients are having. I do the best that I can for them during the work hours. But one thing I do tell my participants is that my work hours are 9 to 4, but my phone operates 25 hours a day, 8 days a week. But I also tell them, if you call me in the middle of the night and it's about some nonsense, me and you're gonna have an issue afterwards. But if you call me in the middle of the night and it's about something real, I got you. I tell them all that. I got you if it's about something real. But if it's about some BS in the middle of the night, you need to know I wear a size 12 shoe. No judgment.
And Leslie, all right, and look, you speak to this. One thing I thank you so much for sharing, and we'll talk about, like you said, limits, knowing where your space can be helpful, where you need to step in another. Totally get that. And the other thing that just came to mind as you were highlighting that is what makes all of you, that caring you bring to your work, that makes it impactful, is also the thing that you have to be mindful about. And that is that really delicate space, which is you care. This, of course, is going to impact, but how can I also find space to nourish myself? And critically important, and is a practice. And that's the invitation there, because it isn't an off switch. So I appreciate people's perspectives on that, and your humanness around that. We'll pick up on some of the other aspect of just finding that space to operate and making sure what space is important. As Carly and Mr. Brown highlighted there as well. You all, for the comments that you've had and also in the chats, that awareness section is critically important to this model, because we can't separate ourselves from the care that we have in the role, and nor if our space is also helping others help their loved ones. We want to give them permission and that invitation to think about their own coins and their own balance here. Because often, like as Sandra mentioned, that self-talk can be a little different. So we want to be able to put a spotlight on that and invite conversations about caring. In our tour of this model, the communication strategies and the action strategies are something we can bring into play in our own work. And if our space is helping others learn this, we want to bring this also into the model. But one thing, at least in the trainings we do, and we do more in-depth trainings, and when we're working with people individually, often this is where people want to start. Tell me what to do. Totally understandable. You're looking to make a difference. You're looking for things to be different. You want those kind of blueprints. But one thing we do want to highlight, and in our conversation so far, is that these particular communication skills, these particular behavioral skills become more impactful if they're delivered in a context in which people are bringing that set of lenses and understanding into the situation, that behaviors make sense. You may be ambivalent, and I know there are multiple ways to change. And I'm also tracking how I'm feeling in my work. I know my values in the space I'm doing, and I know I'm practicing some self-compassion here. If I can put that foundation down, then when I start learning to talk differently, when I start practicing responding to those I want to help differently, I've got a stronger anchor to be practicing that, because I can lean on my understanding and my self-awareness as I do that. But if I don't have those perspectives, or I'm just not totally aware of myself at all, it makes these ideas really hard to roll out. Because I may be burnt, I may not have patience, I may actually react very quickly instead of responding differently. Or I may not be able to understand your reaction to me. So we just want to highlight what we did together in a brief version, but certainly as we practice this longer, is lay the foundation for these skills to be more impactful. What are these skills? Right? What is the communication science and the behavioral science have to say about how they can be helpful in these contexts of helping? So we'll take a little touch on that for a bit, and we'll be taking a break in the course of this discussion coming up in a little bit as well. In the ITC, the strategies that we capitalize on and bring together are helping get better at communication strategies and responding strategies. So we're just going to do a little bit of a dive on that. For those that do a deeper dive, the behavioral strategies are also found in ideas of craft, ideas of contingency management. There's a whole bunch of different models of helping that leverage these behavioral strategies. Some of them you're already using. Mr. Brown was talking about some of that as well. Communication tools, you'll probably notice for any of those individuals who've taken MI classes or MI workshops, you'll see the same strategies here. Ultimately, when we're helping people with communication strategies, we're trying to just help them see red lights and green lights of communication. One of the cool things we have when we're having conversations, or one of the cool things loved ones have when they're conversing with those they're trying to help, is feedback. Is this going in the right way, or is this going in the wrong way? Is the person I'm speaking to talking to me, engaging in the process, or are they checking out or arguing or shutting down? We can see these with a particular set of lenses. And the nice thing about seeing that is it starts to give feedback about, do I need to switch gears? Or if I'm helping family members, can they see the signaling and be able to switch gears in the course of a conversation? Because as we probably all can share perspectives, communication is one of the first things that totally just gets sidelined and destroyed in really complicated situations. When there are behaviors that are scary, when there's a lot of emotionality involved, fear, anxiety, all of these things can start to undermine communication. So often we can be working with individuals who already say, we don't talk anymore. We're not having useful conversations. So these strategies are a way to try to offer pathways for people to start practicing communication differently. And it's just leveraging the idea that communication, we know, is powerful. Words matter. That communication, when it's working, can take down the heat and emotionality in conversations, can open up doors for more positive behaviors, open up and help repair relationships. And as we did in that discussion exercise, can be ways to respond to ambivalence that can be more helpful than having people get defensive. Ultimately, all the science of communication really says that certain communication styles, when we find or hearing people talk about shouting or confrontation or labeling, shuts people down. And we know when people get shut down, we just have less access to them. And that's a big red light. But how does the ITC think about collaborative communication, or what are the ingredients of that? I'm just going to highlight some of these here as food for thought, and we'll walk through. But certainly these are practices that can be built over time. The first way we think about positive communication is just listening collaboratively, right? And it sounds simply listening as being a strategy, but listening can be one of the hardest things to engage in. Actually slowing down to hear what another one is saying. In our exercise earlier, we had practiced just a speaker talking for a couple minutes. There was no other task involved in there besides listening, right? But as helpers, that can be challenging because we can be thinking, how should I respond to this? What do I need to say? What should my answer be? And once we get caught up in that, it starts to get in the way of listening. So listening is a practice of trying to step away from our churning mind and just be present with another individual and hear their story. So we say it's simple, but it's not necessarily. And often we can practice that with things like spending 2 or 3 minutes with someone in our life to just listen with no other agenda. Or with our clients saying, you know, right now, what I'm going to do is I just want to hear what you have to say. And I'm not going to say anything for a couple minutes. And take that pressure off of having the right thing to say. Of course, conversations have more than just listening. I'm going to talk about the OR skills and just a strategy for offering information, which we call the information sandwich. But in the ITC, there are specific communication skills that can be built on and practiced. And that's the beauty of this. We're not necessarily experts in any of this, but in our work, as we were talking before, and as Sandra mentioned, and if we can make room for practicing, thinking about how could I do things differently, this is the blueprint that could offer ways of responding differently. So that 2-minute pause to just listen can be an exercise. If listening is something we can do in any of our relationships. If we kind of say to ourselves or to those, I'm not going to say anything here. I just want to hear what you have to say. Other skills involved in listening that can be built on comes from motivational interviewing in terms of the labeling. It's known as the OR skills. But what the OR skills are just effective strategies for engaging in conversation. And there are 4 sets of skills: the use of open questions, affirmations, which I'll tie back to what Kevin said earlier this morning, which is seeing the strengths or the positives people are making and giving permission for us as helpers or families to actually say we saw that and say it out loud. And then there are finer communication strategies called reflections and summaries a little bit. And we'll touch on some of these right now. All of these are invitations to those we're talking with to talk more. That's the subtlety behind this. When we use these, we're inviting people to talk more. So I'm curious to start with open questions, which listener 2 did earlier in our practice. They're invitations for people to tell us more. They cannot be answered as a yes or a no. They actually are inviting people to use more words. But what I'm showing you here are 3 closed questions. And how do I know they're closed? Did you drink last night? Can be yes or no response. Don't you want to change? Technically can be answered yes or no. Or haven't you even thought about trying? Well, I can certainly answer that in yes or no. But if I want to convert these to open questions, you have a worksheet, page 8. But even if you don't have access to that, could you write down on a piece of paper and put in the chat, how would you convert one of these to be an open question? And remember, open questions were what listener 2 did. How, what, when, or tell me more. So did you drink last night? How could we convert that to an open question? I'm going to monitor the chat. You can shout it out as well if you want. Did you drink last night? Yes, no. When was the last time you drank? Okay, so Tim is expanding that. Tell me what you did last night. Thank you, Debbie. Beautiful, right? Can't be answered as a yes or no.
You could also say, what did you do last night?
What did you do last night? Thank you so much. Yes, that's an open question. Right? Notice if I'm using that, I'm going to have to practice listening because my invitation to you as a speaker is to tell me more. Liam, on that one, don't you want to change? How do you want to change? Beautiful, right? A beautiful how question. What does change mean to you? Ray Chile Davis. Yes, thank you. Beautiful open question. Ray, both of those. I can't say yes or no to that.
What would existing in the new space look like?
Beautiful. What would existing in the new space look like? Another open question. How about how do you see change? Thank you, Dale. Yes. Haven't you even thought about trying? Now, of course, my tone can make that very unappealing. Tell me what happened last night. Yes, Sandra, beautiful. What does change mean to you? Tim, that's Catherine. Have you thought about trying? What does change look like to you? Leslie, yes. Awesome. We're all knocking this out of the park, right? Here are some of our answers. But all of the input, notice here what we've flipped. Why do we highlight this? Well, as helpers, often in our work as humans, we can get easily drawn to close-ended questions. That can be a heavy weight in conversations because what we're communicating to another person is, I'll ask the question, you just give me your one-word response. Or if our space is to be helping family members who are saying our conversations really don't go anywhere, one thing we can invite people to think about, or for anyone who's saying they're feeling like they're not necessarily being heard, is how can we help you learn open questions? Let's think about this together. Let's practice this. These are invitations and conversations to invite other people to bring in. What are you challenging towards there? That's great, Leslie. Thank you. So that first step, open questions, seem like a slight nuanced shift, but can be profoundly effective in starting to repair conversations and invite people to talk more. They also send this curiosity, which is, I'm interested in what you have to say. I don't have to have the perfect question for you, but I can ask you an open question and we can start to talk about these. And you'll let me know what's on your mind. Brings a different weight to conversations often than could be close-ended. In top of open questions, when we think about conversational skills, another useful idea is the idea of affirmations. And I know I'll bring that back to what Kevin was saying and recognizing that. There was actually an interesting scientific study where they listened to counselors talking to clients. And they were interested in when are clients more likely to talk about making changes. So they audio taped all these and they coded them, but they were particularly interested in what did the counselors say right before people started talking about changes. And what they noticed is the one biggest predictor in this particular study was when counselors pointed out strengths or affirmations to their clients, that actually led over time to clients more likely to talk about change. So when clients saw that their counselors saw strengths that they had, things they had done that were positive, things that they had said that they shared, and that was explicitly noted in an affirmation by a counselor, that was impactful. And that is this idea of how do I see you? Can I see your strengths? I can validate your experience by saying, I know this could be really stressful to think about. I can know what you value and highlight like, wow, it's really cool you were able to finish that because I know that was important to you. I can notice attempts at change, which I've really noticed that effort you put in for that. I could see the strengths that you have. I know, you're really skillful about the way you talk, or you're skillful about the way you've tried to tackle that issue. They come in all shapes and sizes, but affirmation in the OR skill is that permission to see the strengths and the positives of another individual. The key here is explicitly stating that during a conversation so that others know they've just been seen. The science says when that's part of conversations, people are more likely to position themselves to start thinking about making changes in their lives. It's not a magic bullet, but it plants seeds and it changes collaborative experience of conversations. Could be helpful when we're being supportive of others in that peer space as counselors. It can be helpful to us to say, how can I see the strengths an individual is bringing? And for family members, if they start to think about affirmations, it can start to change the tone and the way people are interacting in their home. Because often it could be about what's not going right all the time. Jared, I like that confidence scale you highlight there in the chats. And Dale, yes, client-based strength is a starting point. Affirmations fall in line with all of that. When you listen to counseling sessions, when they publish on all these, the thing you're almost least likely to hear in counseling sessions is affirmations. Not because counselors are necessarily not aware of it, but because so often counseling sessions can be focused on what's not working. And that pull can just inadvertently bring us to also not seeing what is working. So affirmations are a challenge to see the bigger picture in which individuals are operating in their strengths. Another strategy in yours that can be part of this is just reflective listening. I'm going to touch on this. This is in MI trainings. This is something that takes a lot of practice because it's not our usual way of speaking. But when we're in conversations with individuals, sometimes we don't need to have the perfect thing to say, but we can just use our listening skills to say back to a person what we've heard them say. We're holding a mirror up to them. And that can be helpful in saying, I'm sitting with you and hearing what you have to say. But I'm not going to put pressure on myself to come up with something magically insightful, or it's a magic bullet. It's just saying to you, I'm going to communicate back to you what I've heard you just say. So we're sitting with a friend or someone we're supporting, and they come back to us, and this can be anxiety provoking because we know they've been trying to step away from alcohol or abstain from alcohol. And they come back and they say, oh man, I just need a beer or two to be able to have a good time. Well, all kinds of warning bells can go off. We can get pulled in all different ways. But if we're using reflections, which is just stating back to a person what they said to us, does anyone want to take a stab at the chat of just offering a reflection? If you were just to restate to a person what you heard them say, what would that statement be? What would that reflective statement be?
Maybe. So you don't feel like you can have a good time without a beer?
That's great. And who was that, Kevin?
That's Kevin.
Hey, all right, Kevin, I'm recognizing your voice. That's awesome. The one thing I would say, the way you said that, it was spot on. If you say that again without inflecting your voice at the end, just keep your voice flat. And I'll tell you why I asked you that in a moment. But could you restate it, just keeping your voice flat?
So you don't think you can have a great time without a beer?
Awesome. That's a reflection. Notice if I say this, you can have a good time without having a beer. Once I raise my voice, I flip that to a closed question. That's the subtlety. So your flat way of saying that just kept it as a beautiful reflection. That's awesome. Ray has that as a question. If you, Ray, just said that as a statement, questions aren't bad. I don't want to give that sense. They land differently. Our idea with reflection is I'm just giving you back a statement. And the way Kevin had that, the flat version, just states it and we're passing the baton back to a person. Let me see, Amanda. Why do you feel the need to have a beer or two to have a good time? Amanda, I'm going to reword that to a reflection. You feel the need to have a beer or two to have a good time. Notice I've just dropped the why and I kept my voice flat. Dale, do you necessarily need to have a beer to good time? That's a great question. But if I'm in reflective mode, I want to just not ask a question, but I want to offer a reflection. So that could be, you need to have a beer to have a good time. That would be Dale's converted question. Heather, I'm hearing that you need a beer to have a good time. Tell me more about that. So Heather, that's a beautiful reflection followed up by an open question. Why? So you're all using questions beautifully. Nothing wrong with questions. Here's the practice. And this is what makes reflective listening just a little bit more challenging. We're staying away from questions. We're just saying back what the person said. Basically saying, this is what I heard you say. Is that right? Here are some examples of reflections that also fall in that bin. Having a few beers really helps you connect. It's not exactly what they said, but perhaps that's what we hear them saying. It's hard to have a good time without a beer. It's important to you to be able to socialize at the end of the day. So that's kind of linking this thing. At the end of the day, they want to have a good time. Now, why this is tricky is I might be pulled to try to convince them to not have that beer, because I know in the past they might say, I want to abstain. The function of a reflection is not to convince, it's not to ask a question. The primary purpose in reflective listening is to just let the person know, this is what you just said. And I heard that. And I'm giving you the baton back. It's a different way to hold a conversation, but notice behind that, it's allowing a person to hear themselves talk out loud. That's what it's doing. These take practice. This is not the natural way of talking. Reflections can be used in any conversation we have, not necessarily with our clients or in tough conversations. It can be with anybody. But it can be practiced when we step into a conversation just to say, my goal here is to offer one reflection in this conversation. I'm going to state back one thing you said, and I'm going to see how you respond to it. They're critically important ingredients in motivational interviewing when you start practicing that, because there are ways of having conversations with not telling people what to do. They're not offering advice. They're asking people to hear themselves talk out loud and then respond to themselves. They also, for us as counselors, mean we don't got to come up with the right thing to say or convince people. We can always lean back on them and just offer a reflection back. Okay, before break, I want to highlight offering advice. So we can practice, and we've got a taste for listening skills. Can I practice listening? Can I step back? Can I be mindful and use open questions to invite you to talk more? And if I notice myself leaning on closed questions, I can always come back around and notice I can convert them to open questions. Sometimes you may still answer with one word, but I know if I ask open questions, I'm letting you know I'm interested in what you have to say. I could start to practice bringing affirmations and strengths into my conversations a little bit more. I can help families learn that. And when I really want to practice, I can start learning about reflective statements. Now, I just want to put an aside. Often reflective statements can be helpful if people are really angry and have a lot of emotions. We can just state back, you're really angry. I hear that you're really upset. And that can help bring down some of the emotionality and some of the temperature if someone's really in a tough spot. So there are useful ways to practice that. Some people ask, well, what if I want to offer information? What if I want to offer advice? What if there's something I want to share? So in that set of skills, that's critically important. And we ask you to think about something we call the information sandwich. Comes out a little bit of MI, but when we're going to offer advice, offer recommendations, offer our perspective, maybe offer our own lived experience, we want to make sure people are going to listen to it. They want to hear it, and it's going to be useful to them. Because we've all been in situations where we get unsolicited advice. Like, if we all think about our journeys, there are times when people have no problem telling us what they think we should do to try things out. Sometimes it's things we've already tried. Sometimes we're really not interested in hearing advice. We just want to talk out loud. So how can we check in with people around those helping skills? And top of the information sandwich just has a particular way of thinking about it. And that is, before we offer any advice, we just ask permission. And that can be just a statement like, hey, I have an idea about that. I have something that may be useful. Or we can help family members think about that. Would you want to hear it? If we start to ask permission first and knock on the door, we're saying, I want to be collaborative here. I want to check in with you to make sure this advice is something you listen to. And I'm giving you a little bit respect here in terms of your autonomy, because you have the decision to listen to this or not. So that first idea of permission is knocking before we enter into someone's apartment or house. And it's impactful. It's respectful. It can be heard that way. And we can do that with just these kind of statements. Would it be helpful to hear about? Could I offer a thought? Would it be right if I asked you a question? Hey, you know what? I worked with other families that have tried something. Would you want to hear what others have done? Would you want to hear, I've had an experience that might be useful here. Would it be all right if I tell you about that? The critically important thing here is, if I ask these questions and a person comes back and says, no, I don't want to hear it, we got to respect that. Because if we ask permission and someone says no and we still go through with it, then it kind of undermines the whole process, right? The next time someone's going to know. But if we do ask that and we get that green light, it just means someone's let us into our house. So we can provide feedback, we can provide information and advice. We've just got a better shot that they're going to listen to it. It could be offering suggestions or paths, experiences, but we're respecting their autonomy. They've let us in, so we can just deliver it in a way that's saying, let's see if this will be useful to you, because you've allowed me to do that. And critically important in the sandwich is the second part of the sandwich or the bread, which is asked after I've offered the advice. Can I check in with you? How did that sound? Was that useful? What are your ideas about what I just offered? What are your thoughts on what was just said? Which, as a helper, that's good for me. I can understand how useful this was in our conversation. And I can get your feedback about the advice I has just given to you. And it gives me information about the advice I offered. It also lets me get a better idea of how this was heard by you. Because perhaps maybe you've heard this and it wasn't the way I was trying to have it delivered. So I can also, it gives me the ability to reword or to correct perhaps what your perception was of what I said. It offers a lot of utility. Often advice is given without that checking back, which is, how did you hear what I just offered you? So the information sandwich is just a strategic way, a useful way to think about how advice can be presented that maintains collaborativeness and offers a space to check back in with people on the conversation. I appreciate some of the chats around the practice. I offer these ideas as food for thought and initial skills. And I do want to say it's all about practice. No one's born an expert in using any of these. The cool thing is we can bring it into any conversation we're having and just try them out and make it our voice. But they start to change the tone of conversations and a sense of collaborativeness. And for us that are also trying to help others use these skills, can help people start trying out a different way of interacting with loved ones that starts to shift. It changes the context and it starts to shift the dynamics. Any questions up to this point? Conversational skills, communication skills, easier to put into play, again, on the foundation of awareness and understanding. My tank is empty and I'm always in reactionary mode. It's going to be hard to think of an open question or to reflect or to even see something to affirm. So these skills become more impactful as those other skills are practiced. It is a little bit before the hour of 2. Why don't we come back at 10 past? Use this time for a break, a stretch, a walk around, and we'll come back in and talk about some of these behavioral strategies at 10 past the hour. Okay. And thank you all for your comment up to this point. And I know we've touched on a lot of food for thought so far, but I've appreciated at the same time your insights and chats along the way. Leslie had a question. Reflective statement is not a question, but to make a comment or statement concerning. It is. And to Leslie's point, it's not to offer a question. That's a different kind of tool we can use. We can think about open questions and the questions we're using. Reflections are more about just making a statement. The statement is just offering back what the person just said. So if someone said, I'm uncomfortable, a reflective statement would be, you're uncomfortable. At its basic level, that would just be me offering back what I heard you say. And not the most often used tool. So this is something that does take a little practice, but can be particularly helpful in just being able to listen and offering back what you just heard. And it usually keeps the conversations going. And for people on the receiving end of reflections, often their experience over time is that person really heard me. That person really got me, because the reflections allow us to check in with them. This is what I hear you saying. Is that what you're saying? And is that what you're meaning? So Leslie, hopefully did that answer your question? Okay. Thank you. And we'll also have time, Dale, I appreciate that, reflective, having to practice. And I do want to highlight that some of these conversational skills just take practice with awareness. Any questions up to this point? Any statements anybody want to offer? This gets to be part of the afternoon where that can feel heavy, that 2 o'clock in the afternoon kind of experience. And I want to at least highlight that. You have to stand up as I'm talking, stretch out by all means. Okay. All right, so we've touched on understanding. We touched a little on awareness. Hopefully these just bring your attention to these concepts and skills, and it's just an invitation to start thinking about how they fit into your work as a helper, how they could be part of your style, or how they could be helpful to some of the families you're working with that you want to offer skills, and we'll point you to some direction of where there's more discussion of these for deeper dives. The part of the talk that we're going, if we have this idea of the importance of self-awareness and values and self-compassion and understanding, and in that context, the invitation to start using different communication strategies. The second part of the action part of the ITC is just some of the behavioral science. And when I go through this, again, this is just going to be a way of thinking about perhaps how you're including this already in your work, putting the labels that we're using, and for those that are trying to help other family members learn ways to interact. These can be just the beginning of thinking through how these ideas and strategies can be brought into their life. Okay, so here we are, kind of have covered a lot and the communication, and we're going to just talk about what do we mean by behavioral tools in the ITC? Where is that coming from? How can we think about them? And at its basic core, when we talk about behavioral science, and that blending of science and kindness, that science part around behaviors, in one way is trying to think about all the nuance and the ideas behind these linkages. That when a behavior happens, there's a response, an experience following that behavior, and it can have one or two effects. If an outcome of behavior strengthens a behavior or reinforces it, it makes that behavior more likely to happen again. And if a behavior happens and the response of the world or the response to that behavior is in a way that weakens the behavior or decreases it, doesn't reinforce it, the behavior becomes less probable. This, at the core of behavioral science, is trying to understand how behaviors get strengthened in our behavioral portfolio, and behaviors that we learn, how do they get weakened or less likely to occur. And we could probably spend the whole day talking about the neuroscience of learning and dopamine and neurotransmitters and PET scans and understanding the neurobiology of learning and reinforcement. There's a whole courses on addiction around that when you hear about the neuroscience and neurochemistry of learning. But what they're trying to map on and trying to learn is this very relationship. What strengthens behaviors makes them more likely, and what weakens them to make them less likely. At that level, that's behavioral science. So we want to kind of capitalize and think, how can we respond to behaviors that make them more likely, or help loved ones respond to behaviors And how can we or loved ones respond to behaviors that make them less likely? Notice what I'm not saying is getting rid of or erasing. There's nothing that can erase a behavior when it's learned. Nothing that gets rid of behaviors. They just make them less likely, right? And for those that out there, I always kind of tell people, we can keep this in mind. We took a survey on how many of you have learned how to ride a bike. And there was an announcement that bike riding was bad for you. And you came to see Ken Carpenter, his treatment for bike riding center. And I promised you that at the end of our conversations, you will have unlearned how to ride a bike so that you will never know how to sit on it again. It will feel totally foreign to you. You'll have no way of doing that. And we really pushed on that as you were going to pay for this treatment. And I said, do you really believe that Ken Carpenter is going to erase how you learned how to ride a bike? Most people would probably say, well, I can get rusty at it. I can get less well at it. But one thing Ken's not going to do is erase or make me totally unlearn how to do it. And just the message behind that, often we think about change when it comes to behaviors. People are going to unlearn it. People are going to get rid of it. And really, the whole process of change and learning is learning new behaviors and making them stronger. And the behaviors that we would like to do less of, just figuring out ways to make them not as vocal and not as automatic. But because we can't erase it, there's always this idea of ambivalence and always these circumstances where old behaviors can always kind of pop their head and show up. So let's kind of walk down this first thing, not of erasing behaviors, but what's the importance of reinforcing, or as Kevin mentioned earlier, seeing behaviors and change and responding to it in a way that makes them stronger. That's the process of change. That's the process of learning and bringing in new behaviors. Right? And I just want to give this quick story of a garden. My wife asked me, hey, this year I do all the gardening. Ken, I'd like you to actually go and start tending the garden. So I got a little nervous about that. And I was like, well, all right, I can try that. I want this garden to look like the thing on this slide. That would be awesome if I could result and get something to look like that. But I'm going about my business and I'm trying it. And I notice as the flowers are growing, a sense of weeds. And I start getting worried about weeds because I've been told if you're trying to grow a garden and weeds show up, they're pretty scary things to have to deal with. So when I see them, I go to my neighbor and I ask Phil there, hey, Phil, look, I've been asked to grow my garden this year and I'm noticing weeds. What should I do to help that? So Phil looks at me and he says, Ken, the thing you got to do, weeds, you should be scared of them. The thing you got to do is you got to cut off all the water. If you cut off all the water, you're not going to let the weeds grow. Wait till the weeds wither away. And then after that happens, you can get back to gardening, get back to the watering. So on one hand, I was like, all right, yeah, that makes some sense. I don't want to water the weeds. They can get out of hand. But I felt a little uncomfortable with that advice to cut it all off. I don't know. Is that, you can chat this, should I be concerned about that strategy? Is there a downside to Phil's strategy to me to cut it all off? Anybody? Everyone agree with Phil? Anyone have a little hesitation to me listening to that advice? Not a good plan. Yes, you cut off the way. All right, him. Not a good plan. I mean, you would just pull up all the weeds. Right? Okay, TJ, I'm going to get back to that. That's a black one. Feels extreme, Christina. Oh, thank you all. All right. Well, you're all saving me a bad decision, it looks like. So thank you for all that. Right. I think the spirit and what people are saying, that can be extreme. There's a downside to that, right? Yeah, that makes sense if all you're focused on is the weeds. But if you're focused on growing other behaviors, other flowers, they need the nourishment. That at the end of the day, if you cut it all off, the things you do want to support and nourish are also going to fall by the wayside. So while Phil had a point around the weeds, he might have been a little too extreme on how to go about and deal with it. So I go to my other neighbors and they're like, yeah, look, his garden doesn't look too hot anyway, Ken. I don't think I would follow that advice. Our advice to you is water everything. Just shower that garden with water and love. Keep your fingers crossed that the weeds don't outgrow the flowers, and just hope the flowers outgrow the weeds. So there was something about that advice that appealed to me about, all right, they're not telling me to cut off all the water extremely like Phil did to the flowers, but what are some concerns about their advice? Are they on deck? Do they have, is their advice helpful? Just water the whole garden, everything, just with water.
That might be too much.
All right, might be too much, Kevin, right? Not the answer either to Heather. Okay, Kevin, right. And too much meaning what, man? What would, Kevin, what would that?
Too much water.
Too much water, right. That feels kind of scattershot from Christina. Gotta take the good with the bad, as Amanda's noticed. Too much water, not all the plants take. Right, so all experts, I'm benefiting from everybody. I think I got a better shot at this. That other approach is also too much. It's scattershot. It's not nuanced. It's missing some of the important nuance that can go with supporting this garden. That thinking about this more strategically in terms of what are the things we want to support in water, and what are the things we want to think about being more strategically, is probably the better middle ground. So to base this discussion on all of your expertise, we want to be nuanced. What do we want to reinforce in water to strengthen the behaviors we want, or I'm going to say the flowers we want to grow? And when we're working and helping people or helping families, how do they want to respond intentionally to the behaviors they don't want to grow? Now, where this metaphor breaks down, as TJ noticed, in the gardening world, I can find a weed and pull it up from its roots and take it out of the garden. But as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to behavioral science, there's no way to pull out undesirable behaviors. There's no erase button. So the metaphor here is, if I know behaviors are already growing and I can't pull them out, there's no erase button. How can I think about responding in a way that's more nuanced? Water the flowers and the behaviors I want to support, and be mindful of those that I don't. And if my space is working with families and others, how can they start thinking this way as well? Dropping the idea that behaviors are going to be erased, but thinking in the context of your relationships. Let's think about how you want to water the parts of your loved one you want to help grow, and how you want to respond more thoughtfully to those behaviors that you don't. So in some sense, when we're helping people change, we're helping them grow a behavioral garden. And to some extent, we're gardeners because we're being asked to sit and watch the change process happen. And as people, as Heather and Dale are making, we're trying to help that process be put in a light that clients see the process happening, and that can bring their wisdom, their gardening, their behavioral strengthening and responding skills in a more thoughtful way. It's interesting. Oh, here we go. Another way we can think about this, and I'm going to capitalize and talk about this, is there's always a choice in responding to someone's behavioral portfolio or garden. Identifying the flowers and the behaviors we want to support. Definitely trying to clarify the flowers or the weeds or the aspects that we won't support. And then there's this challenge of the middle ground of things that perhaps fall in the middle. While we don't necessarily want to support them, we're willing to allow them to grow in the context of our relationship. The want, willing, won't is one way it's put out there as a framework for just starting to start our conversation, start to look at our garden. What do we want to support? What won't we support? And what are we willing to experience? Which is that balance that Heather has talked about. And we're going to use this as a framework. The first framework here is reinforcement. I'm going to use different analogies with that or metaphors, but reinforcement is the process of watering flowers in behavioral science. It is what strengthens behaviors and helps them grow. It was mentioned when we talked about affirmations, and Kevin put that out there. Affirmations are positive reinforcement. They strengthen the process. It's verbally. We can think about reinforcement in a lot of different ways. But that's where the want column is, helping people and ourselves to think, when I'm looking at this person's behavioral garden, what would I want to keep my eyes open for to water? When we get towards the end of thinking of behavioral reducing strategies or responding intentionally to the behaviors that we won't want to respond to, we'll talk about these three ideas just to introduce them. How natural consequences impact behaviors, how limit setting can be brought to play, and as well as the utility of stepping away. Again, I'm not introducing these here as erasing strategies or controlling strategies. They're not. They're just ways to respond intentionally to behaviors that we may not want to reinforce. And that just may, in the context of the relationship, make them less likely to occur. So just some ideas of what I mean by positive reinforcement and how it's spoken about out there. It is noticing a behavior and, in a sense, responding to it that strengthens it. We can use the word reward. It's not just about being nice or scattershot. It's actually responding to a specific behavior that you see. It could be the way a person spoke. It could be someone showing up on time. It could be someone calling with a real issue that Leslie mentioned and thinking about, hey, I appreciate you calling because this was something that was important to you. Just picking up the phone is reinforcing. Notice positive reinforcement is not about bribing, and I'll talk about that. It's about how to respond to a behavior that has occurred. So the behavior has to occur. You know, I can't water the flowers if the seed isn't planted. It's not like watering dirt hoping a seed now gets planted. It's the response to the growth, to the behavior. Critically important, reinforcement, or watering in this sense, is most impactful when it's consistent in timing and follows the behavior in a measured way. I just say that because, remember, when we started our discussion, behaviors make sense was this idea that drugs are reinforcers. It's another way we can think about this, that drugs are reinforce drug use behavior. And that's important because when people are making change, they're bringing in new behaviors, and that has to compete with drug use. That's part of the process. And drugs are consistent and timely in the effects they produce. So new behaviors, new growth, when they're reinforced in a consistent, timely way, helps those new behaviors take root. Right? And that is something that makes them important as part of that supporting process. I'm going to switch slides, and Leslie, go for it. I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. I just want to say, positive reinforcement, that's something that I actually learned as a child. My mother, she was real good at positive reinforcement, because me being me, I was a complete knucklehead as a kid. My mom, when I did something I knew I wasn't supposed to be doing, instead of putting a belt to the body, my mother would talk to me. My father, on the other hand, he was good for putting the belt to the body,
Yeah.
But that's what we learned as our age group. That's what we learned as children. When you do something wrong, you get a beating. My mom, that's not what she did.
Right.
And thanks to her, that was one of the driving forces of me going into the military. Thanks to her, that was one of the driving forces of me getting married and having children. Watching her examples.
Yeah.
And I just want to share that.
I appreciate that, Leslie. Thanks. And if it's okay to lean on your experience, the way you outlined it as we go through, I so appreciate your highlighting the impact that positive reinforcement can have, and the different ideas on how to lead people in their lives and to give traction and supportive scaffolding. And we can get pulled, as you mentioned, there's a pull to go to other strategies. You mentioned about as ways of thinking. This is the thing that's going to be the way that's going to teach a lesson, or that's going to impose on that. And that's while on one level it can be appealing, there's downsides to that. And so thank you, Leslie, on just the power of reinforcement and highlighting that and contrasting it in your experience. What Leslie highlighted in his journey and in his life is this idea of when behavior is reinforced, it gets stronger, it gets deeper roots, it gets traction, it stays over time. So that process of reinforcement, in some ways, we can think of it as planting the seeds for the longer journey. It's what keeps behaviors moving and gets traction around that. And it has certain advantages for the helper. It allows us as helpers, or for those that are taking on that helping role, interact with loved ones in a way that sustains and strengthens behaviors, that infuses a different quality to the relationships, allows helpers to be seen in a supportive way, allows in times of difficulty, it allows helpers to be seen also in a positive light. And I'll get back to this. It means we can, as helpers, offer positive reinforcement, even at times if we have to set a limit or we have to give someone feedback. Their experience of us in those situations are going to be a lot different if they've also experienced us as offering positive reinforcement. So it changes the quality of interactions. And it allows us to care as helpers, and allows family members to care and connect with their loved one without being labeled in stigmatizing ways as being codependent or enabling, which I'll talk about. Those words come from particular domains, but in their extreme versions, it means if you're doing anything that's reinforcing for a loved one, you have a problem. And that just undermines the strength of reinforcement, the power of relationship. For the person on the receiving end of positive reinforcement, it increases the likelihood that they feel seen. It increases the likelihood that that behavior starts to become meaningful to them, because sometimes it's hard to see the behavior as meaningful when it's new, but it can become meaningful if others are also reinforcing and giving that message. And it provides a basis for new behaviors to start competing with those old behaviors. Like we said, that can be tough, particularly in ambivalence. When people are asked to say goodbye to old behaviors and try to step away from them, there's a sense of loss there. So how can learning new things start to grow in the context of those complex ambivalence? So positive reinforcement allows that for the person receiving it. But it's a process. It's not an easy thing necessarily to always bring into play. We're humans. We have our own responses. If we're helping others trying to learn this, they'll have their history, their responses. So to position ourselves to be able to use positive reinforcement, sometimes it comes quite naturally and easy, and sometimes in the context of an interaction, it can be a challenge. Yet it requires just answers to 2 questions coming out of the gate, like we said in this gardening. What behaviors of flowers would I want to support and encourage? And when I see them, what's the water going to be? How am I going to respond to them knowing my loved one? So, Leslie, I want to take, if it's okay, just the story that you used, because you painted a contrast on 2 ways that we could think about how learning can happen. And certainly, you know, it's in the culture, and then it comes generationally, you know, has been in different blueprints. But I'm going to ask all of you to be behavior analysts with me. I'm going to show you a video. And in this video, they had one task they wanted to do. They wanted to increase people taking stairs, right? So that's the scenario. And there's different ways we can think about it. People are going to show up and they're going to have to make a choice. Do I take the stairs or do I take the escalator? So we can think about, if we were helpers and we wanted to influence the decision people make, I can go about this in 2 ways. I can focus on getting people to stop taking the escalator, or I could focus on trying to grow or increase stair taking. Just 2 different strategies out of the gate. So by showing this video, my question to all of my colleagues here as behavior analysts, what's the specific behavior they want to support? And what is the reinforcer, or what water did they use to grow that behavior? It's my 2 questions. And then we'll just come back and touch base on that in a second. They had a challenge. They wanted to increase the behavior. Anybody want to shout out or chat? What was the behavior they tried to strengthen or grow?
Taking the stairs.
Taking the stairs, I know. And then specifically, if we micro that really down, their stair taking, what was the micro behavior? And this is a weird question, but we could think of taking the stairs as going the whole distance. What was the more basic behavior they were looking at?
Putting more effort in.
Okay, effort, right? Effort behind each step. So the very behavior was, how can we get a step to occur? What was their reinforcer? How did they reinforce a step happening? Anyone want to take it? Make it fun. So Tim, yes, that's a big one. I'm going to say, boiling it down, what was the world's response to every step that a person took?
The music.
The music, that's it. And Leslie, I saw your response as well. Every time a person took a step, they heard a sound, piano sound. So did that increase stair taking at the end of the day when people were seeing that and getting reinforced for taking the step? I don't know if you caught that. Yes, it did. Leslie has that, right? There was a 66% increase in stair taking by making stairs reinforcing. That was, we want to grow step taking, and the water we're going to use is, let's make each step reinforcing. We're going to put a note on it. That was the experiment. And that shifted behavior. So this example in this world was, how does positive reinforcement increase or shift decisions? That was one strategy they used. What strategy did they even address escalator taking? Was there any mind paid to that? No. Right. So the first strategy was, what happens if we want to increase a new behavior? Just reinforce that. Does it start to grow? And in this particular example, yes. And even though they were trying to get less escalator taking, they did that by reinforcing another behavior. And Debbie has that, ignoring the negative, and we'll talk about that. Now, Leslie also says we could think about making escalator taking less appealing. We could break it. We could tackle people when they tried to run on or get on the escalator. We could push them off the escalator. We could shock them if they're on the escalator. We could flip it around. So there could have been other strategies to stop escalator taking. But the first attempt here was to increase the behaviors they wanted to increase. So stopping escalator taking is not the same as increasing stairs. They needed to know how to water those new behaviors of stair taking and blocking the escalator, yes. So here's just a reorientation and why I show that. Is sometimes when behaviors are scary, and there's a reality to this, I'm not ignoring it, the mind could be towards the stop solution. What do we do to stop? How can I control that behavior? And what gets lost in the picture is, well, if you're asking behaviors to stop, what are the behaviors you want to start? How are you going to support them? How are you going to grow them? So this example was showing the tactic of just starting with, how can I support the behaviors I want to increase? And that in and of itself can shift behaviors. I'm not saying it's a magic bullet, but it's often the ingredient that's lost, particularly if taking escalators is really scary. That's where our mind will go to stop that. So if you're okay with me kind of building on this idea, well, how can we think creatively about positive reinforcement then What are reinforcers? So I'm going to lean on you all and your wisdom. Reinforcers come in all shapes and sizes. Without even knowing a person in their context, what are some of the things that come to mind when you look at this bucket or this slide about things that could actually be water to behaviors that you would want to grow? That people would experience those responses to their behavior in a way that would invite them to engage in the behavior again. You can chat, you can say it out loud.
Confirmation.
All right, a confirmation, right? That's an acknowledgement, Dale. That is a free reinforcer. All that costs is just a response, a verbal response.
I would say small steps, like little portions, not too much.
And Kevin, with those small steps, what would be things that could be nice for the person or reinforcing for the person for those small steps?
Positive affirmations.
Okay, totally.
Encouragement.
Right. And that's awesome, right? You're highlighting that even if we use that example, reinforcement can occur with each step. It doesn't have to be at the top of the staircase. It doesn't have to be after someone climbing Everest. The small steps and the affirmations is reinforcement. How about
as well as positive reinforcements when they start doing whatever it is they're doing, give them slight little data boys or that's right, keep going.
Totally, Leslie, exactly, right? Noticing those initial steps, helping build momentum, critical use of reinforcement in the process. In those behaviors kind of growing roots. Absolutely. And I love the way kind of the smaller steps, because those steps are so important. They have to happen. And I think as being pointed out, they can be lost. Reinforcers that are activities, anything that if someone were thinking about, hey, what could be reinforcers and activity, what comes to mind? Spending time, Debbie, yes, right.
How about make it entertaining?
Entertaining, absolutely. Bringing some kind of, putting a different context around it. Making it entertaining can engage people in it for sure. Make the behavior. Right.
Yeah.
Right, Dale, I'm not sure if you know your mute's off on that. Just want to give you the heads up. Spending time with them, as Debbie said, and Christina, I'll get back to your point in a moment. Always showing up no matter what, right? Your presence, social reinforcement, being present with someone, showing up could be a reinforcer. Absolutely.
Hey, Ken, how about making it somewhat like a contest with a prize at the end?
And what would be a prize that would come, Leslie? What would come to mind for you?
Well, depending on the situation, it could be anything. It could be go out for a cup of coffee.
Yep.
Trip, yeah, thank you, Edgar. Trip to a museum or something like that.
Totally.
Something educational and fun.
Yes, that's great examples. Great examples. And they fall back in as they could be an activity and, could cost a little something. Both that falls in both of those. But exactly, those would be beautiful examples of offering something to someone as a way of helping them engage in a behavior. The idea in thinking about this, right, is that idea that reinforcers can just be words, can be our presence, a showing up, could be saying a presence, it could be activities, it could be things like buying a cup of coffee and others. They don't have to be huge. All they function the same here, which is I see you've done something that may have been hard for you or something that's, in line, and I want to be able to support that. So I just want to be intentional to make sure I see it and respond to it. Critically important. And that is the process of reinforcing. Just want to do this exercise with you all as you're bringing your creative thoughts to this. I'm going to read the scenario to everyone. This is also on your handout on page 9 and 10, but it's already building on the things you just offered. Imagine speaking to someone in this scenario, and we want to help her just think about this idea of positive reinforcement. What flowers would you want to grow? What behaviors would you want to support? And what could be potential reinforcers to do that? So Sally's a mom of Janice, who's 16, and in Sally's words, Janice recently lost a job and her grades in school are getting worse. She seems to be on something, and she's always tired when Sally sees her. Lately, Janice doesn't want to be in the same room. She rarely talks to me about what's going on, and whenever I ask her a question, it turns into an argument. I just wish things were easier, like the way they used to be. In fact, the only time she seems to be in a good mood is when she's playing a guitar and writing music. Sally says I'm a single mom and have given her and her brother as much of my time and energy as I could. I can't get through to Janice. And I noticed that I've also avoided her, which feels awful. So Sally's already noticing how she's feeling, awareness. She's trying to understand Janice's issues. But what we'd like to invite Sally to think about in this scenario, and you can chat it or you can say it out, what could be, if Sally were to think down or think about what behaviors she would like to see grow and support. What stands out in this narrative? What could be some things to brainstorm with Sally about, or ask her, what part of Janice's garden do you want to grow? What would you want to see? Anything stand out to be? The music. Okay, so maybe reinforce more music playing. That could be a behavior to water, and that's already kind of in there. Other things that Sally may want to grow? Do you think maybe, I'm looking at the chat here. Perhaps Sally wants Janice to start talking more with her, right? So that could be a behavior. Conversations aren't going well. So Sally might be like, I want to increase our conversations and invite Janice into that. Anything else that people could see in this narrative that maybe Sally would want to help sprinkle water on or to see start to grow?
Spending time together.
Spending time together, right? Just sitting in each other's presence. Sitting in the same room together. That maybe is another flower or part of Janice's behavioral. We've touched on reinforcement in a lot. We've spent a bulk of our time in the ITC and thinking about understanding awareness and positive reinforcement as a process for helping the change process, and these critical ingredients in building scaffolding around a helping relationship. These are the fundamental parts in this scaffolding. And while limit setting is there, you'll see that in your slides. I'm holding off on that because ultimately, on a deeper dive, the process is the same want, willing, and won't scaffolding that we have. But anyone have burning curiosities about bringing this into their work in a way that would be important to have answered, that we haven't in our discussion? I hope this invitation is a way to just start thinking creatively about how to bring this into your work, and as an invitation to start to think about how these can be coming from your voice, and certainly knowing practices behind it. We'll have resources that can be available to further explore this and build on your practice of these ideas as you bring it into your repertoire.
Our link to our surveys in the chat. Please complete it if you can. Thank you so much for everyone for your time and attention. And I thought this was going to be a long training, but it went really quickly. Thank you, Ken, for such a fantastic training and to give us a different perspective on thinking about attending to substance use and abuse. We really appreciate all that you and your organization are doing. Everyone, please chat
Thank you for having me, Karen. Thanks for your support and everybody's input. Thank you so much for your participation.
Yes.
Thank you,
Please-
Karen.
Yes, everyone have a wonderful day and I hope to see you again soon, okay?